All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Senior Council Division Coffee Hour for the month of November. Today we have our guest speaker, Dani Moreno. Uh, Dani Moreno has worked in towards servicing people and her communities as a sommelier, End of Life Doula, and patient care coordinator. After becoming a hospice volunteer in 2018, Marino began the journey into the hospice industry and navigating end of life alongside her patients. And with that, welcome Dani Marino to today's coffee hour.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for making time to talk about this super important topic in terms of not just America or the world, but definitely in Oahu. Um, yeah, thank you for having me. So today we're definitely going to talk about who am I, of course, and what is a death doula, um, what is hospice, reframing death and dying, volunteer service, and then a little bit about why volunteer service matters. I believe more than anywhere in the country, definitely in Hawaii. So when I say hospitality to hospice, I have been a sommelier, um, a level 3 sommelier on the East Coast mostly. Um, and I also have worked in fine dining. In all of these fields, I don't think people expect it, but I experienced some pretty serious and unprecedented deaths. I think if anybody's seen The Bear, that can kind of allude to the lifestyle that I'm talking about, and I really appreciate everybody being here just to talk about this because it unfortunately is a taboo topic a lot of times, and it doesn't have to be. But in my experience, those unprecedented deaths when I was living in Washington, D.C. and New York propelled me to start volunteering for hospice. I had a really loving, tough loving friend in the Buddhist community saying, you should just get used to it. People die all the time. And so I started volunteering back in 2018. I started doing it so much so that I had a doctor, a chaplain, and a nurse all recommend me for a scholarship to become an end of life doula. They were like, I think you should do this. I think this should be your job. And so I'll to get into what types of volunteering because that ends up happening a lot where people use volunteering as like a legacy project or a legacy like memoir for their loved one. And then they end up working in it just like me. It's really life changing. But anyway, the International End of Life Doula Association. Death doula, end of life doula, they can be interchangeable, but I started working professionally as a death doula at the end of 2022. So not for very long, but I have basically changed my whole career for it. So yeah. What is a death doula or end of life doula, whichever wording works best? Um, when it comes to the actual word doula, the direct translation is servant or assistant in Sanskrit. Um, I think people's initial experience with what a doula is at the beginning, which would be for a birthing doula. I think if anybody's had children or nieces or nephews, grandchildren, knowing that finding out when you're pregnant, you have 9 months, imagine people just not doing anything to prepare or get organized, buy diapers, get the room ready, your car ready to bring the baby home. even afterwards, what that looks like inside of your like breastfeeding or postpartum. It's a huge major life change, bringing a life into the world. And I think it's really unfortunate and silly to think that when a life is leaving, we wouldn't do the same kind of preparation, and how much joy could still be associated around it. And so, and with it for a death doula, I do everything a doula would do at the beginning, I would do at the end, pretty much, in terms of emotional, physical, informational, and it doesn't matter. It can be before, during, or after death. Most of my clients are at the spectrums for me. So, especially on Oahu, when I'm dealing with people who have just experienced a death and then they're grieving. So it's at the very beginning and they have a lot of anxiety around death. And then a specialty of mine is 11th hour. An 11th hour patient is in their final transitional phase. That's a very common term used in hospice, transitioning. So when we're talking about that, when we're using that word, it's actively passing. We're all dying right now, just a little bit in the same moments of living. They're happening at the same time, but transitioning, there are signs, and I can talk about that in a little bit later. So how do we prepare? How do we prepare? I was talking about all the preparations you would do for a life. And I think a lot of you, especially in this meeting, do a lot of the preparations in terms of like legal legacy planning, post, living wills, advanced directives. Those are incredibly important. And especially when you're talking about elderly, when you're talking about what's happening in this day and age. In terms of social media, I recently had a patient who her mother has passed away, and the stepfather is running all of the mother's social media accounts, phone, as if she is still alive, and pretending to be her. However, there's not really too many laws in place to protect that, other than from what I've understood from another lawyer on island, is that can be adjusted in the literal will itself, but there's not enough laws around that. So it's something to be aware about for you guys in particular when working with the seniors or anybody that needs to write up post living will, etc. So that's like the literal and fiscal part of it. But in terms of preparing emotionally, I do a lot of work around death anxiety and getting used to those conversations that regard, like, I think a lot of death is a lot of empathy. And I laugh just because while I think we all have it, I don't know if we know how to practice it actively, even with ourselves. And so when it comes to getting used to death anxiety, just taking a moment to almost write what you would put in your obituary. Those few sentences of what you think your life could mean or will mean to others really causes a lot of reflection, great reflection, but it is also hard to come to terms with. But that's a really quick activity or workshop to make you start getting prepared emotionally just for your own passing, therefore being able to be there when somebody else is as well. Something else that I like to do is graveyard support. So when there's an anniversary or the first graveyard visit or cemetery visit, I will gather everything, clean, organize it so that when the family comes or whoever's there, they can have peace and like kind of not have to worry about too much. Um, in terms of the actual active passing, that transition, it's really interesting. The last things to go, or the last senses that are still left with you when you're passing, are hearing and sense of smell. So that's a fun fact if you're for yourself and for your loved ones, but that's a major part of what I prepare, the sound and the smell, because you can still provide comfort. You think that even if somebody's not responsive to you, you think that they're not doing anything. I promise you, those last two are probably still there and they will react. I was with a patient a month ago and they're like, oh, can you just watch her? I need to go run an errand. Don't worry about it. She hasn't talked or moved in months. And I was like, I hear that, but do you mind telling me their like favorite music or whatever? And Mel Tornay, they used to do, her and her ex or her ex-husband used to do swing dance together, and they love Mel Tornay. And I just played it the whole time. Auntie never talked or moved, but then towards the end, she started like moving her legs like to the beat. And so those moments are still able to be had. And it is really nice to be able to gift that to your community and your loved ones. So now I talked about death doula things on the less hospice side, but I have worked at Bristol Hospice and St. Francis Hospice on Island. And so what is it? What is hospice? It is a comfort care that is for the terminally ill. Terminally ill is defined as 6 months or less. You need 2 doctors to sign off on that, typically. And hospice goes to wherever you are in most every state, especially this one. So that could be in your own home, a facility. You can be in your own nursing home and then have a different hospice come in and a nurse will come in and help take care of you, or a foster home. Hawaii is one of the few states with a significant amount of foster homes for patients whose families can't constantly take care of them or with no family at all. So they provide everything: education, physical assistance, bereavement, emotional and spiritual support. It is a law. The patient has a team of a doctor, a nurse, a social worker, spiritual counselor, a home aide if the company is large enough, like the hospice company. They can be nonprofits, but most of them now at this point are not. Therapists, they have to have bereavement counselors and volunteers. Medicare mandates a team of this, every single patient. And that team talks about their patient, they're legally mandated to talk about their patients every 2 weeks in an interdisciplinary team. And we all have to be there. When I was at St. Francis, I had about 200 patients, and Bristol, I personally had 380 patients. So those meetings are pretty long, and very thorough per patient. But just to be clear, hospice is not a death sentence. Not at all. Hawaii especially, and I'll talk about why for a couple reasons, but Hawaii especially, at Bristol, 47% of our patients live longer than 6 months. It is not that way. However, when I was in DC, Washington, DC, my patients were passing within 3 months. So it's definitely a different type of quality and comfort care given here. I also think people have a huge community support. And when I tell you people have the will to live, you absolutely do. And so it is basically a unique thing. Yeah, I would say it's one of the most unique areas to work in hospice because we're one of the 9 states that provide medical aid in dying. So you can come here if you have a terminal illness, and um, that requires 2 doctors to sign off on. However, if you're of sound mind, you can decide to do medical aid in dying. It's absolutely possible here. I also think there is a huge amount of like elder and kapuna care here, and it's a nice place to have your final days and it not be so hard. In terms of weather too, I mean, the cold really hurts, especially with the main 5 causes or diagnoses that you'll see in hospice. Cancer is the most in America, but not here. So it's cancer here, COPD, dementia, Alzheimer's. Dementia are a set of symptoms, and then Alzheimer's is the actual disease. If we didn't already know that, and then heart things, cardiac arrest, heart attack, and then stroke at the bottom here. So when I would say most of our elders here, since they live so long, if you live long enough, you're going to get dementia. That's just it. That's not necessarily a sad thing. It's just what happens. And then Alzheimer's is just an actual disease. You'll see things like frontal lobe dementia really lead immediately into Alzheimer's. But the unfortunate thing about this all over the country in terms of hospice is that when you're diagnosed with Alzheimer's, it's a pretty long time until you're considered or deemed hospice eligible. And that is a major issue on Oahu because you're finding people with this diagnosis and then unable to receive free Medicare for hospice, even though they're not able to take care of themselves, because there's a scale. It goes all the way to 7. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then between 5 to 7, you have 5A, 5B, 5C, all the way down to F. So until you reach 6A, you're not deemed like hospice appropriate, usually. You'd need another diagnosis of some sort. And 6A is, I mean, you can look up the scale for yourselves in your own families or your own clients, but it's really tough. So having advanced directives, if they find out that they have any type of Alzheimer's, it's super important. Obviously, really tough. People are fairly prideful, of course, but letting them know it's going to take care of their family in the future and themselves is going to be a huge relief. So I just wanted to touch on this. She's an incredible death doula, and so I'll play this for us. Sorry. Uh-oh.
End of Life. Her story was discovered through our brief but spectacular open call for ideas from the public. Founder of the organization Going with Grace, Arthur guides individuals and families, reframing the conversation to help people think about what they value most in life. Tonight, Arthur shares her brief but spectacular take on living like we're dying.
I really still struggle with why we're not talking about death culturally and societally, because for me, it seems to be the most enriching conversation that we could have. There's a great big what happens after we die that nobody has an answer to that just scares the living daylights out of most of us. My brother-in-law, Peter St. John, was diagnosed with Burkitt's lymphoma. So I went out to New York and essentially walked Peter and my sister and my niece through the last 2 months of his life. I did all the supportive things around his death, and it was, I think, helpful to have somebody else to think about those things and handle them. Peter's end of life was the way that I finally saw what the need actually is and what the role could properly look like. A death doula is somebody who does all of the non-medical care and support of the dying person and the family or the circle of support through the process. There's a number of details that people really overlook when it comes to preparing for death. Things like who you want to make your decisions for you in the event that you can't, what type of life support you want, what kind of care you want to receive at the end of your life. We need to look holistically at our lives and think about all the information and knowledge that only we hold that's going to be really hard for somebody that we love to handle after we die. One interesting element of the work is that we learn to understand that we're going to be falling in love with people that are leaving all the time. And so going in, you form these really tight relationships, you get to know people, you get to know their families, you get to know what they cared about. It's hard to not fall in love with them. We grieve with them and we grieve for them as well. Planning for our deaths is a really important tool and powerful way to help us understand what we value in our lives. For example, when I'm thinking about my death, I'm thinking about my relationships, who I loved, how I loved them, whether or not I was loved. I'm thinking about my work, what imprint have I made on the world. I'm thinking about my legacy. Will anybody care after I'm gone? My hope is that from my work, people take away how precious this life is, that they really engage with this gift that we've been given to feel and to breathe and to eat and to have sex and to dance and to cry and to feel the full gamut of emotions while we're here, because it's a very, very brief time that we're here. My name is Elua Arthur, and this is my brief but spectacular take on living like we're dying.
And what a
So I just wanted to share that video because I think it's really great to see how one could go into this work, but then also it doesn't have to be a dark or all logistical thing. It is very human and emotional, and it's okay to let that happen, because when we were able to give that space, I think a lot of learning happens on both ends, and it's twofold. It's a gift for the person passing to have dignity and presence and respect all the way. And then the other end of us being able to acknowledge the fullness that from the beginning to the very end, that life of your loved one can give you. So just these are some questions that I tend to ask after when I first meet up with somebody about end of life. So just for you guys to reflect. But in particular, I love my experience in Hawaii when it comes to hospice, because the family and the culture here is so life-giving, truly. When I said 47% of my patients last past 6 months, it's because we have family coming in. We have even the caregivers, caretakers, they're coming into the space from such a different light than I've seen before. And I mean, Stanford did this study for 30 years where being lonely is just as deadly as smoking. It takes 7 years of life off of single women and 13 years of life off of single men if they're chronically lonely. And when it comes to hospice, I feel deeply, especially the things I've seen. I have a patient that was in our service for 7 years, And when talking about the Medicare side of things, like how do you define why that person still gets to hospice? It's because there's a literal decline every single time they visit. And that could look like weight loss, mental deterioration, alert and awareness deterioration. But still, this auntie, she's been on our service for 7 years. She's 107 now. And every time I visit, she has a great niece there or a grandchild there helping give her milkshakes. So I think she has something to live for, you know? And like I said, you have the will to live. So anyway, and which is leading into why not just volunteering matters, but why Kapuna care at all. Caregiver burnout. Because we have such a high amount of elderly care, I haven't seen anything in terms of literal things being passed, but I heard that it was discussed that would be in place next year. Hawaii would be the first to offer partial Medicare benefits to palliative care. And in addition to hospice care, we'd be the first state. Because we have such a high amount of centurions and elders, over 72. So caregiver burnout, not just volunteers, but certain hospices have facilities where you can put in your patient or your or client or loved one for like 2 weeks. Like St. Francis does this. And if you're going on vacation or you're just burning out, so you would tell your social worker or honestly anybody in the team, because everybody talks to each other, that they need a break for themselves. Volunteers around island usually do this caregiver relief, and it's only 4 hours. But you'll see a lot of this happen during like graduation season here or things like that. Part of the hospice team. So hospice was initially all volunteer ran. It wasn't until 1982, I believe, I think it was 1980, because 82 is when the AIDS crisis was deemed as a crisis in America. And so hospice became almost mandatory thing for those patients, because one, they were experiencing discrimination, but two, there was no cure or yet. So that's when Reagan gave Medicare benefits for partial time, and then eventually in the late 90s, hospice became a covered benefit by Medicare. Now that covered benefit only is around $36,000 a person, which it typically equates to 6 months of care. Now, it depends on how much you use up that. You can have a baseline of coverage and then you can get extra things. But if you use up that money, it will still always be free. Depending on the hospice, they will front that bill and then try to get that back through through filing back with Medicare every year. That does and does not happen, which is why a lot of hospices turned from being nonprofit into profit, because they started growing. I actually don't think hospices should be that large, because it has its own checks and balances. So back to hospice being used to be all volunteer based. Volunteers are still a required necessity of hospice care. They're required to be a part of 5% of operational hours to check the balances of growing too much as a hospice. And just raking in like Medicare, it tends to be around $200 a day. That's how much it costs typically. But yeah, and in addition to providing presence for not just the patient, but for the family as well. They're the only non-medical member of the team in addition to the chaplain. And if you're not a religious person, then this is like your only opportunity to have human interaction that's not only about taking care of you. So yeah. So that was my presentation, everybody. I'm super grateful to have this time. There's my contact if we need it. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any and all questions. I'm sure there's a lot of things in terms of DNRs and living will questions that we may or may not have. So yeah.
Okay. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and then I'll read it out loud.
In general, I just want to say I think we all need to do something for the memory care in Hawaii. It would be nice to have some kind of memory care facility like in South Korea, because it's such a huge thing here.
Okay, looks like we have a question.
Perfect.
How can we retain a doula?
How can attain?
Retain.
Retain. I mean, there's only 3 of us on island. So very easy to find, I would say. But I would say if you go on International End of Life Doula Association, you're going to see me and my other 2 colleagues. But if you want, I have their contact as well. So yeah, it would just be us if you're talking about on island. But off island, it has a map and where everybody is and where everybody lives. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Next question. What is the average cost? Is it hourly, monthly, etc.?
Sure. It depends on the doula. So like and what they do. So my mentor, I have 2 mentors that taught me and trained me to be a doula. One literally is just a writer and a publisher, and all he does is finish people's books for them before they pass, or puts together whatever they need to send up to an editor or whatever. In that way, my other mentor does the beginning. She is both a birthing doula and an end of life doula. So we all do different things in terms of that. So we could do an a la carte kind of menu where the graveyard site for me would be like a $200 situation in addition to covering whatever things I get. But I work on a sliding scale usually, and I do $80 an hour, but I always work on a sliding scale. If that.
Okay, next question. Besides caring for the patient, what typically does a doula do for patient's family and friends?
Yes, that's such a great question. I think I'd say half of what I do is for them in the same way. For me, when I'm talking about the patient, I'm just somebody to walk through that with you, that journey. And in the same way with the patient's families, I'm there to walk through there with you, but also help prepare, because in a lot of ways, I think sometimes I empathize a little bit more for the families because they're the ones that are going to keep going. So I do a lot of grief support workshops, legacy. One of them recently, this woman, she doesn't follow this practice, but I basically like shrine ofrenda for her mother, who she wasn't able to be there for her during her death and funeral because of her own sickness. And so I actually helped her organize her own little obit funeral situation here on Oahu. So those are things, because humans are so ritualistic, and we need, like, even just waking up and grabbing yourself a cup of coffee, that ritual. And if you don't, something's a little off all day long. In that same way, we need to keep and maintain rituals around death and dying. So yeah, I hope I answered that question for you. I think I'm seeing some questions. Okay. I can answer these. End of life doulas are predominantly women. There's twofold reasons of that. I'm not sure. So my sister-in-law is also a funeral director on mainland. She's so there's twofold, and especially, and then in the Jewish community as well, a lot of the death care is taken care of by women, because historically men have been known to defile bodies. However, in terms of women being predominantly doulas, I think it's because of the direct correlation between birthing doulas, and most of those people are women when it comes to birth. And then it's a very easy, weird slide over to the end of life. So yes, yeah. I don't need to be referred by a hospice or a physician. No, I have my private self. And then in terms of, I was working with Bristol Hospice and St. Francis Hospice, but I was doing volunteer coordinating and patient care planning in terms of non-medical things. So if an uncle told me in Kaneohe that he's never dyed his hair, I brought him blue hair dye and we dyed his hair before he passed. So things like that. Another question I saw. Okay, you said payment. We figured that out. Being a doula, you can be a doula and volunteer. The whole concept of being a death doula isn't necessarily just volunteering. I think that's where it started off as. And that's why I work on a sliding scale. I do take payment from people who can afford it, but I've very much so done most of this, I guess, pro bono. Yeah, I don't believe people should have to worry about their costs either in terms of income when it comes to end of life. I don't think so at all. That's why I'm grateful for the Medicare benefits. I just worry sometimes about the larger hospices taking advantage of the Medicare benefits and not fully taking care of their patients. I'm a big fan of foster homes on island. I feel like most of them I've ever experienced have done such a great job utilizing the money properly. There are angels of death. I'm curious because in my experience, angels of death, Melvin, when you said that, I've associated that with a positive thing, but I'm curious what you have experienced with it. In my experience, angels of death have been these quote unquote spiritual or energy surges where people think that their loved one is completely back to normal. And it's because they had this surge of energy and they basically were unresponsive, but now they're waking up, talking, wanting to go surf. That's something here if your loved one says that. And then hungry. And I consider it a gift to be able to experience that last moment with them. And then they usually pass. That's an active moment of transition. They usually pass within 3 or 4 days after that. you can consult a doula at any time, I'd say. I think, but Melvin, if you want to type something, please. I'm curious about the Angels of Death thing. You can consult a doula at any time, before, during, after. I think everybody should have a advanced directive, no matter what stage of life you're in. I think that is really important. I think in terms of course, like a living will, but a post is also important. Usually people only are asked to ever fill out a post when you're at your end of your life. But when you are, I think, like even in the LGBTQ community, you should have an advanced directive and a post ready. I think it just relieves not only you, but your loved ones. What I find when I'm talking to people on their deathbed is their biggest thing is, I don't want to be a burden. And I think that's twofold here, because we come from a culture that's so community based, and we want to make sure that everybody else around us is taken care of so that we can be at peace. And so by taking care of ourselves in this way is another way to do that. But yeah, Angels of Death. I want to almost like look that up and see what you mean by that. Also, I don't know if I said it, but you do not have to. You can still. Oh my gosh, how do I word this? You don't have to have a DNR to be in hospice. You can still be resuscitated if that's something that you wish or your family wishes. So yeah. You know, I have watched those things. I think that's really great to almost it's almost like a daily reminder. Those YouTube videos with the local reverend that you're talking about, living in your own swath. So I think it's, when I do death doula training, we talk about little deaths and getting comfortable with little deaths so that we can be more comfortable with the big ones. And I feel like that's one of them. Little deaths, like it's the rain is here and now it's not. I think culturally, Hawaiian people are really used to that. Buddhist culture, really used to that. But Westernized people, whether we're Hawaiian, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, doesn't matter. I think just if you're Westernized, this is like a hard term to come, or a hard thing to come into play. And living in your own swath. Oh, living your own death. Oh no. I think, yeah, but it's a hard thing. When I did this training, the whole time I'm in a group of like 60 people around the world, and our whole thing, this day one is like, okay, while we're doing this training, you're going to pretend like this is you dying. And I think getting used to that is really hard. So I think a step before that might be, or like an introductory step, is getting used to the little deaths of, wow, that meal was so good, I'm never going to have that meal again. That kind of impermanence, and getting used to the joy of the impermanence. Yeah, if that makes sense. There's a great movie. It was at HIF last year, not this past year. They played it at Perfect Days. There's almost no dialogue in that movie, but I was crying the whole time, and it was a lot about just enjoying the day-to-day. Yeah, I think I'm excited to see, though, back to what I said, living wills, what they look like for this day and age, to keep people protected. Also, in terms of the internet, social media, emails, things like that. I hope I answered.
I think that's all the questions we have in the Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, there's no other questions, I want to thank Danielle Moreno for coming in today to speak about hospice care. Just a friendly reminder that there will be the next Senior Council Division Coffee Hour will be on January 9th. So of 2025. So I want to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you again, Danny, for another presentation. If anyone has any more questions directed towards her, I believe, can you put up your contact information again?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me share my screen. Sorry. Wait. Oh no. I'm sorry. There we go. Can you see that? Or no?
No.
Ugh. Okay. Share screen. Share.
Um, Okay, yeah, you see your contact information. So, your contact information's on the screen right there. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to contact her. With that being said, thank you for everyone for attending. Have happy holidays and happy New Year, and we'll see you back in 2025. Thank you, everyone.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody.